I'd like to read you a story from my collection called Locked Out, Stories Far From Home. It's the only story in the collection that's in the voice of a male character, and it was inspired by things that my father told me about growing up in suburban St. Louis in the 1930s and early 1940s. He did indeed play in a jazz band as their piano player when he was 14, performing with men, and then when he was drafted at 19, he did arrangements for the Army Jazz Band. But that was later. This is The War of the Worlds. Being on the couch with Mrs. Schumacher wasn't anything like being on the couch with Betty Riddle. For one thing, we were completely alone. That idiot Bert Guthrie wasn't peeking in the window to see how far I got. For two, Mrs. Schumacher was making me listen to classical music, and for the first time in my life, it wasn't something people talked over. I had dropped in to see if Walter was home. To get there, I walked past the Hartman house. As usual, Tootsie and his brother Wolf were out in the yard, shouting unintelligibly and trying to kill each other with pitchforks. I understood why my parents preferred it if I avoided them and their family. I didn't understand their reservations about Walter, though. He never picked a fight, and when he disagreed with you, it was impossible to know it until you thought about the conversation later. Even so, this part of town, the area where most of the Germans lived, was the one area we didn't hang around in. It was too quiet, the kids all said. But it wouldn't have been quiet if we'd played there. Walter wasn't home. He was helping out at his father's hardware store in Clayton, but Mrs. Schumacher invited me in anyway. She said, "Would you like to come in, Tom? I'm listening to some music." I didn't have anything to do, and the way her voice stayed level instead of rising into that range people use to be polite to children made me feel comfortable. I was 14, and the Nazis were about to take Paris. The Schumachers' living room wasn't at all like ours. It was olive green and wooden and textured, where ours was light blue and flowered and smooth. We both had pianos, but ours was a baby grand, and it had photographs in silver frames all over it. Theirs was the concert version, and it was bare. Mrs. Schumacher went straight to the gramophone and picked up the needle to stop the music. "I imagine you thought I'd be listening to Wagner," she said in her gently accented way, "but today it's Verdi." I'd never heard of either of them, so I kept quiet. She replaced the needle. "Come," she said, and we sat on the couch. She didn't turn toward me to make polite conversation, but faced forward with her knees pointed at the gramophone, so I did the same. I tried to tune in to her, but she was tuned into something else. After a while, I said, "I play the piano." She said nothing for a moment, then said quietly, "So do I." She didn't look at me. A little bit later, she said, "Verdi was a church organist at age 7. Many minutes passed before she said, "Listen to the clarinet." I played piano in a jazz band, so I could identify the clarinet easily. Our clarinet player's instrument never spoke as unforgettably as this one, though. In 1941, people weren't dancing slowly, at least not where we were playing, so his horn was a much more frivolous thing. I had never heard music go on for so long before. Once it was finished, Mrs. Schumacher sat for a moment, so I did as well, and then I began to miss it. I honestly felt the echoes of the notes drifting slowly out the window, and it made me sad. Eventually she stood up, crossed to the gramophone, and picked up the needle again. I cleared my throat, and suddenly she spoke as if I had been making noises about leaving. "I have one more thing to play for you, a little thing." She removed the Verdi, replacing it carefully in its sleeve, like I did with my Tatum and Dorsey records, and replaced it with another. "There's another Italian you must hear." She looked at the sleeve for a moment, then placed the needle where she wanted it. It was a song. A woman sang, higher than the clarinet had, but just as profoundly. Mrs. Schumacher stood by the gramophone as we listened, then picked up the needle again when it was finished. "Alessandro Scarlatti," she added. I nodded. "Some people say that the Germans think a song is only good if it is difficult, and that only the Italians know what a real song is." An image flashed into my mind, and I'm sure I blushed. Louis, our clarinetist, was Italian and represented all I knew of Italy. Just 2 days before, I had been sitting with him in the back of Joe the bassist's car on the way to a gig, and he said to the other guys, "What do you say we show young Tom here a slice of real Italian pizza?" Joe nodded with a laugh, and the guy sitting next to him, Frank the drummer, passed a photo back over the seats. I took it in my hands. It was a naked woman with her legs open. Her head was out of the picture. It was just the legs and what was between them. Whatever I had imagined to be between Betty's bobby socks and the blouse when we were necking on her couch, this was not it. Mrs. Schumacher still stood by the gramophone. I cleared my throat again. "What do you think, Mrs. Schumacher?" "I know what they mean," she said, "but they have forgotten Schumann." I stood. At 14, I wasn't quite as tall as my mother, but I was eye to eye with Walter's. She didn't put her hands on her hips or play with the pearls at her throat like my mother did when she talked. She wasn't wearing pearls. In fact, I don't recall that she was adorned in any way, and her hands were at her sides. I said, "Thank you, that was very interesting," and goodbye. I have no idea what Mrs. Schumacher was thinking that day. I only know what I was. As I walked back home through the quiet German neighborhood, Tootsie and Wolf were either dead or inside their house, I thought, I wonder if I have to go all the way into St. Louis to find some Schumann. Then I noticed the brick wall I had scooted behind 3 years before when I believed Orson Welles about the Martians and had run home from Walter's to save my mother. Then I thought, there's no way that Mrs. Schumacher or anyone's mother looks the way that photo did between the legs. Betty Riddle neither.